Whenever you're sad, look at this and remember you have a friend. Thank you. That is so sweet. I promise. I will come back. I'll wait for you.
She's special to me.
Why do you have a woman's face tattooed across your whole back, boss? The room went dead quiet. 8 of the most dangerous men in Seoul stopped moving at once, the kind of silence that falls when somebody has just asked the one question nobody in that room had ever been brave enough or stupid enough to ask out loud. Seo Ji-hwan didn't turn around right away. He stood at the window of a penthouse 40 floors above the city, half-dressed, the lights of Seoul burning gold and cold below him, and he finished buttoning his black shirt slowly, one button at a time, over a back that carried the enormous, exquisite, impossibly detailed tattoo of a child's face. A little black girl, maybe 7 years old, smiling like she had a secret worth keeping. The man who'd asked the question, a new lieutenant, young, who didn't yet know which doors you don't open, was already starting to understand he'd made a mistake. Boss, I didn't mean 20 years ago, Ji-hwan said, and his voice was quiet, which everyone in that room knew was the dangerous register. I was a thing the world had thrown away. No name worth saying. No one who would have noticed if I stopped breathing. He turned finally, and his eyes, dark, beautiful, and absolutely without warmth, moved across the room until every man in it found something else to look at. And one person on this earth looked at me like I was worth sitting down next to. 1. I have spent 2 decades and more money than this city is worth trying to find her again. He pulled his jacket off the chair. Her face is on my back, he said, because she saved my life before I became the kind of man who needed saving from. Ask me about it again, and I'll show you what I became instead of her. Nobody asked again. Now, here's what I need you to understand before we go 1 second further, because it's the thing that's going to wreck you by the end of this video. At that exact moment, on the other side of the world, in a hospital that treated her like she was invisible, a poor black nurse named Denali James was being humiliated by a room full of doctors who thought she was furniture, and she had no idea, none, that the most feared man in Korea had been searching for her for 20 years. She didn't know his face was on his back. She didn't know she was the reason he was still alive, and she definitely didn't know that in about 3 weeks, a gang war was going to put him bleeding out on her hospital table. The one place in the world where the girl he'd been searching for would finally be standing over him. Tap subscribe and ring that bell because this is the whole story. Start to finish, no part 2. And trust me, you do not want to miss the moment these two recognize each other. Let's go back to the beginning. To a Christmas, 20 years ago, in an orphanage where a lonely boy was sitting by himself. 20 years ago, Seo Ji-hwan was 12 years old, and he had already learned the central lesson of his life, that he was alone, and that being alone was simply the shape of the world. He was an orphan in a cold, underfunded children's home on the edge of Seoul. He had no memory of parents. He had no friends, because friendship in that place was a currency nobody could afford to spend on a quiet boy who flinched. He was bullied, routinely, casually, the way water runs downhill, by older kids who'd figured out that he wouldn't fight back because he'd decided somewhere deep down that he probably wasn't worth fighting for. He spent most of his time in a corner of the yard by a dead tree, where the other kids mostly left him alone. That's where he was that Christmas. The day everything changed, sitting by himself watching his own breath fog in the air, when a shadow fell over him and a voice he didn't understand said something in a language he didn't speak. He looked up. A little black girl was standing over him, maybe 7 years old. She was bundled up in a red coat too big for her, and she had the most open, fearless face he had ever seen. Looking at him not with pity, which he knew, and not with cruelty, which he also knew, but with simple, genuine curiosity, like he was a puzzle she wanted to solve. She was an American. Her name, he would learn, was Denali. She was visiting the orphanage with her mother, who was there doing charity work over the holiday, handing out gifts, serving food, the kind of thing well-meaning people do at Christmas and then forget about by January. But Denali didn't forget. Denali walked right up to the loneliest boy in the yard, and through a volunteer who could translate, she asked him a question that no one in Ji-hwan's entire life had ever bothered to ask. Why are you sitting here by yourself? He didn't have an answer. Nobody had ever wanted one. And that was the beginning. For the next 3 weeks, the length of her mother's stay, that little girl adopted that lonely boy completely. She didn't speak Korean and he didn't speak English, so they built their own language out of gestures and drawings and laughter. She shared her food with him. She taught him clapping games. She drew pictures of the two of them as superheroes. She made him laugh. A sound, the other kids said, they'd never heard him make. For the first time in his life, Seo Ji-hwan felt like he existed. Like he was a person somebody would notice if he were gone. That little girl in the red coat reached into a boy the world had thrown away and switched on a light that, God help everyone who'd later cross him, would never fully go out. If you've ever been the lonely kid in the corner, or if you've ever been the one brave enough to walk over to them, type I see you in the comments, because that's the whole story right there, and it's about to break your heart. Now, here's the part where she has to leave. The day before Denali and her mother were to fly back to America, the little girl did something Ji-hwan would carry for the rest of his life. She took a small photograph out of her coat pocket, a picture of herself, smiling, the kind a mother tucks into a child's bag. And with a stub of pencil in careful, childish handwriting, she wrote something on the back. She couldn't write it in Korean, so she had the volunteer help her translate it out loud as she pressed it into his hands. Whenever you're sad, look at this and remember you have a friend. And under it, your friend forever, Denali. Ji-hwan, who had not cried in years because crying was a thing that got you hurt worse, cried. And the little girl cried too, and she hugged him fiercely, and she promised, through the translator, with the absolute certainty only children have, that she would come back, that they would meet again, that this was not goodbye. Then she got in a car and waved out the back window until it turned the corner, and she was gone. Ji-hwan held that photograph against his chest and, for the first time in his life, felt something he didn't have a word for. Hope. The dangerous belief that the world might contain something good that was his. 3 nights later, the orphanage burned to the ground. It happened fast, in the dead of night, fire moving through that old, cheap building like it had been invited. Children screamed in the dark. Several of them did not get out. Ji-hwan survived only because he'd been awake, as he often was, holding his photograph by the window, and he went out through that window with the picture clenched in his fist and the smell of smoke in his lungs that would never, ever fully leave him. He stood in the snow in his bare feet and watched the only place he'd ever lived burn down with some of the only kids he'd ever known inside it. And in the chaos that followed, the scattering of the survivors, the bureaucratic shuffle of orphans with no names worth tracking, Seo Ji-hwan slipped through the cracks of the world entirely. No records, no forwarding address, no way for a little girl in America, even if she kept her promise, to ever, ever find him again. He was certain, standing in that snow, that he had lost her forever. He was wrong about that, but it would take 20 years and a bullet to prove it. I'm going to move fast through the next part because it's the part that made him dangerous, and you need to understand the shape of it without me dwelling on the ugliness. A 12-year-old with no name and no home does not survive the streets of a city by staying gentle. Ji-hwan survived the only way that boy could, by getting hard, fast. He stole. He ran. He learned which alleys were safe and which men were not. And eventually, the way it always happens to throwaway boys, a crime syndicate found him, and a syndicate is, for a certain kind of abandoned child, the first thing that has ever looked like a family. They fed him. They trained him. They taught him violence and strategy and the cold arithmetic of power, and they discovered that the quiet boy who flinched had something underneath the flinch, a mind like a blade and a complete bottomless absence of fear. Because a person who has already decided he isn't worth anything cannot be threatened with the loss of himself. He rose. Of course he rose. By 32, Seo Ji-hwan wasn't in the syndicate. He was the syndicate, Korea's most feared crime boss, a name spoken carefully. A man who controlled the underground of an entire city and ran it with a ruthlessness that had become legend. He was beautiful in the way that frightened people, with the face of a K-pop idol and the eyes of something that had stopped being able to feel. Sharp jaw, jet black hair, dark intricate tattoos climbing both forearms and up his neck, always in a black suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He had everything fear and money could build. And he was, at the bottom of all of it, still the loneliest boy in the yard, because he never forgot her. Through all of it, every cold year, every terrible thing, he kept that photograph. It was the single thing in the world that proved he had once been a person worth sitting next to. And one night, alone in his penthouse, he took it out and saw that 20 years had nearly destroyed it. The edges were crumbling. The image was fading. The little girl's face, The only face that had ever looked at him with love was disappearing, and Seo Ji-hwan, the most feared man in Korea, was seized by a panic he had not felt since he was 12 years old, the terror of losing her face forever. So he did the thing his men whispered about and never understood. He took the dying photograph to the finest tattoo artist money could buy, and he had that little girl's smiling face rendered across his entire back, enormous, permanent, exquisite, so that the one good thing that had ever happened to him could never fade again. His men thought he'd lost his mind. Nobody dared say so. They didn't understand. The tattoo wasn't madness. It was the only prayer a man like that had left. Now let me take you across the world, to the woman that little girl became, because Denali James grew up, and life had not been gentle with her either. Denali was 27 now, and she was beautiful in a way the world kept refusing to notice. Warm, deep brown skin, expressive dark eyes that still had that same fearless openness she'd had at 7. Long, sleek braids she did herself at her own kitchen table because salons were a luxury she couldn't afford. She had a soft glam she put together out of drugstore products and pure skill, the kind of effortless Gen Z beauty that should have turned heads. But Denali had learned a long time ago that the world doesn't see what it has already decided to ignore. She was an auxiliary nurse, the lowest rung of the hospital ladder, the people who do the hardest, most thankless work and get treated like they're part of the equipment. Denali worked double shifts, emptied bedpans, lifted patients twice her weight, comforted the dying, and got spoken to like a cleaner in a uniform, which is, in fact, exactly what one of the surgeons called her. His name was Dr. Pierce, and he was the kind of arrogant that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. One afternoon, in front of a full nurses' station after Denali quietly and correctly pointed out that a patient's chart had a dangerous medication error on it, an error he had made, Dr. Pierce looked at her like something he'd found on his shoe and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Stay in your lane, sweetheart. You're basically a cleaner with a uniform. Leave the medicine to people who earned the right to practice it." The error was real. The patient could have died. Denali had caught it. And she stood there and absorbed the humiliation in silence because she had a sick mother at home and medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and she could not afford, financially or otherwise, to lose this job. That was Denali's life. Carrying everyone, seen by no one, going home each night to a small apartment where her mother, the same woman who'd once done charity work at a Korean orphanage 20 years ago, was now ill and frail and frightened in a way Denali couldn't understand and her mother wouldn't explain. She had no idea that her whole life was about to be split in half by a gang war and a man bleeding out on a gurney. Drop a black heart in the comments if you've ever been the person who does all the work and gets none of the credit. Denali needs to feel you in her corner tonight because her entire world is about to change. Now, here's the night it happened. It was a Tuesday, near midnight, and Denali was working another double when the ambulance bay doors blew open and chaos came through them. A gang war had erupted across the city that night, and the casualties were arriving. But this one was different. This one came with an entourage. Men in black suits flooded the ER behind the gurney, and the moment the staff saw who was on it, a strange, cold panic spread through the whole department. Because everyone, even here, even in America, seemed to somehow know the name. Seo Ji-hwan. The wounded man on the gurney was somebody. Somebody dangerous. Somebody whose presence in your hospital meant that whatever you did next had consequences. He'd been shot twice. He was losing blood fast, his beautiful face gone gray, and the most feared man in Korea was, in that moment, just a body with a fading pulse. And the doctors, the same doctors who threw their weight around all day, suddenly didn't want to touch him, because if a man like that died on your table, his men might decide it was your fault. Nobody wanted their hands on this. Dr. Pierce actually took a step back from the gurney, calculating his own safety while a man bled. Denali didn't step back. She stepped forward. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care. She saw a human being dying in a room full of people too scared to help him, and the same thing that had once made a 7-year-old walk across a frozen yard to a lonely boy made a 27-year-old nurse shove through a wall of cowards and put her hands on a bleeding stranger. "I need pressure here, and I need it now," she snapped, with an authority that made even the doctors move. "Somebody get me units on the way and stop standing there like he's already dead. He's not dead, not on my shift." She worked on him. She stabilized him. Fast, skilled, fearless, doing the job 10 people with more letters after their names had been too frightened to do. She kept Seo Ji-hwan alive with her own 2 hands without having the faintest idea who he was or what he had been searching for. And then, as she worked, His jacket shifted, and something fell out of an inner pocket and fluttered to the floor by her feet. A photograph. Old. Worn almost to nothing. The edges crumbling. Denali glanced down at it, just a glance between compressions, and her whole body went cold, because she was looking at her own face, at 7 years old, smiling, a picture she had drawn careful handwriting on the back of 2 decades ago, and pressed into the hands of a crying little Korean boy in an orphanage that no longer existed. The world tilted. Her hands kept working on autopilot while her mind fell 20 years through a hole in the floor. It was him. The lonely boy. The boy she'd promised to find again. The boy she'd believed, for years, had died in a fire she'd read about in a letter that made her 7-year-old self cry for a week. He was alive. He was here. He was bleeding out under her hands, and he had carried her photograph for 20 years. Here's the twist that makes this whole story ache, and I need you to sit with it. Denali recognized him instantly. The moment she saw that photograph, she knew exactly who he was. But when Seo Ji-hwan opened his eyes 2 days later in a private recovery room, his men had taken over entirely and found a beautiful black nurse checking his monitors. He did not recognize her. He couldn't. Think about it. The last time he'd seen Denali, she was a 7-year-old child. 20 years had passed. The woman standing over him was grown, transformed. A stranger's face on a body that had been a little girl the last time his memory had a fix on it. He had spent 2 decades searching for a child who existed only in a fading photograph, and his mind simply could not connect that frozen 7-year-old to the composed, grown woman adjusting his IV. He felt something. That was the cruel part. As he studied her eyes, her voice, the particular fearlessness in the way she moved, something deep in him stirred and ached and strained toward recognition. Some animal part of him knew, but the conscious mind couldn't make the leap, and he was too proud and too guarded to say, "You feel like someone I lost," to a nurse he'd just met. And Denali. Denali made a choice in that moment that drives the whole rest of the story. She didn't tell him. Why? Fear partly. The boy she'd loved had become this. A man her whole body recognized as dangerous, surrounded by armed men. A man the entire hospital was terrified of. The sweet, lonely child was somewhere inside that, but so was something she didn't understand and hadn't agreed to. If she announced, "I'm the girl from the photograph," she'd be stepping into the center of his world, and she didn't yet know what that world would do to her. And partly, and this is the human truth of it, she wanted to know who he'd become before she handed him who he used to be. She wanted to watch him, to see if the boy was still in there. So she said nothing, and she watched him watch her, both of them circling a truth only one of them could see. Seo Ji-hwan should have left that hospital the moment he could walk. His men wanted him gone. Every day there was a security risk, an exposure, a vulnerability. He didn't leave. He found reasons. The wound needed monitoring. The doctors were incompetent. True. He preferred this facility. A lie. Day after day he stayed, and day after day he found himself watching the nurse, the one who'd saved his life, the one who didn't fear him the way everyone feared him, the one whose presence quieted something in his chest that had been screaming since he was 12. He started protecting her without telling her. When he overheard Dr. Pierce speak to her like garbage, that surgeon found his hospital privileges quietly, mysteriously, thoroughly reviewed within a week. When Ji-hwan learned she was drowning in her mother's medical bills, those bills were silently paid off by an anonymous source. Every last one. He didn't tell her he was doing any of it. He just arranged her world to be softer, the way you'd protect something precious you weren't ready to admit you'd found. His men were baffled. The boss didn't do this. The boss didn't linger, didn't soften, didn't fixate. But the boss had found the only person on earth who looked at him without fear. And a man who has been cold for 20 years will stand in any sunlight he can find, even if he can't name why it's warm. Denali watched all of it. She saw the bills vanish. She saw Pierce get humbled. She knew exactly who was doing it and why, even though he didn't fully know why. And the boy she'd loved kept surfacing in the man, in the careful way he protected her, in the loneliness she could see behind the danger, in the way his whole body oriented toward her the second she entered a room. She was starting to fall for him, the grown, dangerous, beautiful man and the lonely boy underneath all at once, which is exactly when the story put another man in front of her. His name was Dr. Kang Min-jae, and he was everything Seo Ji-hwan was not. Min-jae was a young surgeon at the hospital, handsome, kind, genuinely good, the rare doctor who treated the auxiliary nurses like human beings. He'd had a quiet crush on Denali for the better part of a year, and he showed it the way decent men do. With patience, respect, small kindnesses, coffee left on her station, a standing offer to listen. He represented in every way the safe and peaceful life that Denali, exhausted, overlooked, carrying the world, actually deserved. He asked her to dinner, gently, no pressure. And Denali, who was being pulled toward a dangerous man she could barely admit she was falling for, looked at this good, kind, uncomplicated man and felt the terrible temptation of the easy path. For a little while, the story holds you right there, between the safe man who could give her peace and the dangerous one who carried her face on his back. Most viewers right about now are screaming at their screens, "Pick the surgeon, pick the nice one. The mafia boss is going to destroy her life." And the mafia boss might have too. Except the story was about to detonate, and Dr. Kang Min-jae, the safe one, the kind one, the one you were rooting for, was about to turn out to be connected to the single worst thing in Denali's entire past. Comment right now, Team Ji-hwan or Team Min-jae. Lock in your answer before the next part, because I promise you, you're about to want to change it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens. Now, here's where it all turns. It happened when Denali brought Ji-hwan to meet her mother. She hadn't planned to, but her mother had taken a turn and Denali had no one to sit with her. And Ji-hwan, who by now found excuses to be wherever Denali was, insisted on driving her. So he walked into that small apartment, this dangerous man in his black suit, and Denali's frail, ill mother looked up from her chair, saw his face, and made a sound Denali had never heard her make, a sound of pure terror. "Hugh!" her mother whispered, shrinking back. You're alive. You survived." Denali froze. "Mama? You know him." And then her mother, shaking, finally let go of a secret she'd been carrying for 20 years. A secret that explained why she'd been afraid for so long. A secret about the night that orphanage burned. "That fire," her mother said, staring at Ji-hwan. "The one that killed those children. It wasn't an accident, baby. I always knew it wasn't an accident." She gripped Denali's hand. "I saw something, the last week we were there. Something I wasn't supposed to see. And I spent 20 years praying it would stay buried because the man behind it became too powerful to ever touch." Ji-hwan went very still, because he had always known something about that fire too. A buried memory, a thing he'd seen as a child the week before the flames and never understood. Men arriving at the orphanage at night, paperwork changing hands, children being taken who never came back. The two of them, the survivor and the witness, started putting it together right there in that small apartment, two halves of a truth that had been waiting 20 years to meet. The orphanage fire was not an accident. It was a murder, a cover-up, a building full of children burned to the ground to destroy evidence and silence witnesses, because someone had been using that orphanage to traffic children, selling orphans, kids with no names, no records, no one to come looking, and when there was a risk of exposure that someone had simply set the evidence on fire with the witnesses still inside it. And the someone who'd ordered it was a man who had since become one of the most powerful, most respected, most beloved figures in the country. A man currently running for president. His name was Senator Arthur Kang, and by the time Denali and Ji-hwan uncovered the truth, he was a beloved public figure, a philanthropist, a family man, a candidate the whole country adored, a man whose face was on banners promising a brighter future. 20 years ago, he'd run a quiet, monstrous operation trafficking orphaned children for profit, using under-the-radar children's homes as his supply. When an inspection threatened to expose the orphanage on the edge of Seoul, he gave an order, and a building full of children burned so that his secret could live. He'd spent the 2 decades since building a spotless public image on top of those small graves, and he was about to win the highest office in the land. But here's the twist that made Denali's stomach drop through the floor. Senator Arthur Kang had a son who had followed a respectable path into medicine, a son who was kind and handsome and good, or seemed to be, a son who'd been quietly, patiently courting a certain auxiliary nurse for the better part of a year, Dr. Kang Min-jae, the safe man. The nice one. The one you were rooting for. His father was the monster who'd burned the orphanage, the monster who'd nearly killed Ji-hwan, the monster whose crime had haunted Denali's mother for 20 years. Now, I want to be fair to Min-jae here because the story is, and it matters. Min-jae did not know. He had no idea what his father truly was. He'd grown up believing the public image like everyone else. He was a genuinely good man who happened to be the son of a genuinely evil one. But it didn't change the horror of the collision. that the gentle suitor Denali had almost chosen was the child of the man who'd tried to erase the love of her life from the earth. The safe path wasn't safe. It never had been. It led straight back to the fire. Powerful men have a sense for when the ground shifts under them, and Senator Arthur Kang felt it. His people had been watching, quietly, the way powerful men watch, and word reached him that Seo Ji-hwan, the Korean crime boss, had survived the orphanage fire 20 years ago and was now in America. Worse, that he was circling a nurse whose mother had been at that orphanage the very week it burned. Two loose threads from the worst thing he'd ever done, suddenly in the same city, suddenly close, suddenly connected. If either of them remembered enough, if either of them talked, everything the senator had built would burn the way that orphanage had burned. So Arthur Kang made the decision such men always make. He decided to silence them both, permanently. He put resources into motion, professional and quiet, and he targeted the weaker of the two threads first, the one without an army, the one whose only protection was a man who didn't yet know who she really was. He went after Denali. They took her on a Thursday night from the parking structure outside the hospital. Fast, professional, gone before anyone knew to scream. And when Seo Ji-hwan got the call that Denali James had been taken, the most feared man in Korea did something his men had never seen him do. He came apart. While his men tore the city apart looking for her, Ji-hwan went to Denali's apartment, searching for anything. A clue, a lead, a thread to pull. And in a drawer in her bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, he found a photograph. Old, worn, the edges crumbling. It was a picture of a little Korean boy, 12 years old, sitting by a dead tree in an orphanage yard, not smiling, looking at the camera like he didn't understand why anyone would point one at him. It was him. A picture Denali's mother had taken 20 years ago of the lonely boy her daughter had befriended. The other half of the pair, he'd given Denali a photo of herself. She'd kept a photo of him. And on the back, in handwriting he had memorized 2 decades ago, in the careful letters of a 7-year-old girl, it said, "Your friend forever, Denali." The same hand, the same words, the exact same promise that was written on the back of the photograph tattooed across his spine. The world stopped. Every piece slammed into place at once. The nurse who'd saved his life, the woman who didn't fear him, the face that had ached at the edge of his recognition for weeks, the reason his whole body turned toward her like a plant toward the sun. It was her. The grown woman was the little girl. The nurse was the photograph. The person he'd been searching for across 20 years, and half the world had been standing over his hospital bed, checking his pulse the entire time. And he'd been too blind, too guarded, too late to see it. He had finally found her. And in the same hour, he had lost her. For the first time since he was 12 years old, standing barefoot in the snow, watching everything burn, Seo Ji-hwan, Korea's most feared man, the monster they whispered about, sat on the floor of her bedroom with both photographs in his shaking hands and wept. Not from fear, from the unbearable 20 years in the making grief of having held her and not known it, and the terror of losing her twice. Then he stood up, and he stopped being a man who'd lost her and became a war. If you're feeling this, if your chest is tight right now, drop a white heart in the comments and subscribe, because the most dangerous man in Korea is about to burn down a presidential campaign to get her back, and you are not going to want to miss how this ends. Here we go. Seo Ji-hwan did not launch a war for territory. He did not launch it for money or power or revenge in the cold way he'd done everything for 20 years. He launched it for her. And a man fighting for the only thing he's ever loved is a different kind of dangerous than a man fighting for profit. He turned every resource he had, 2 decades of underground power, money, information, and fear, toward 2 simultaneous goals: find Denali and destroy the man who took her. His network found the senator's operation fast because Ji-hwan's people were better at darkness than a politician's hired professionals. But Ji-hwan understood something crucial, something that made him more than just muscle. Killing Arthur Kang wouldn't be enough. The man was a presidential candidate. His death would make him a martyr and bury the truth forever. The truth had to come out. The fire, the trafficking, the children, all of it. So, even as his men closed in on the warehouse where Denali was being held, Ji-hwan was doing something cleverer and crueler, assembling the evidence, the buried records, the witnesses, hunted down after 20 years, his own childhood memory, and Denali's mother's testimony. And a paper trail the senator believed had burned to ash 2 decades ago, but hadn't. Not entirely. Ji-hwan gathered it all and aimed it, like a second weapon, straight at the media. and then he went to get her. The confrontation happened in a warehouse at the edge of the city, and I'm not going to walk you through every second of the violence, because the part that matters isn't the gunfire. Ji-hwan came through that warehouse like the end of the world. His men cut through the senator's hired guns, and Ji-hwan himself moved through the chaos with a single-minded focus that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the woman tied to a chair in the center of it all. He reached her. He cut her free with hands that were, for the first time in 20 years, not steady. And Denali looked up into the face of the dangerous man who'd come for her and saw, underneath all of it, the lonely boy from the yard. And she said the thing that broke him open completely. "You came," she said. "I knew you'd find me. You promised you'd find me again." "You're the one who promised," he said, his voice cracking. 20 years ago, your friend forever. I've been looking for you my whole life, Denali. I had your face on my back and I still didn't—" He couldn't finish. "I know," she said. "I knew it was you the night you fell out of that ambulance. I've known the whole time. Why didn't you—" "Because I needed to know if the boy was still in there," she said, holding his face in both hands. "And he is. He's right here. I can see him." And that's the moment Senator Arthur Kang's last gunman, hidden, desperate, raised a weapon and aimed it at Denali. Ji-hwan saw it a half second before it happened, and the most feared man in Korea, who had spent 20 years protecting himself because no one else ever would, threw his own body in front of the woman he'd searched the world for, and took the bullet meant for her. He went down hard. Denali screamed and caught him, lowering him to the warehouse floor, her hands pressing against a wound for the second time in their lives. Except this time, she knew exactly who he was, and this time, it was so much worse. "No, no, 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 stay with me. Stay with me." She begged, the nurse and the 7-year-old girl screaming at once. "You don't get to find me and leave. You don't get to." Ji-hwan looked up at her, his beautiful, dangerous face going soft and gray, and he smiled. The real smile, the one from the yard, the one he'd only ever shown one person in his entire life. "I found you," he breathed, like it was the only thing that had ever mattered, because it was. 20 years. I found you. Don't talk. Save your— It was worth it, he whispered. All of it. Every cold year. If it ended here with you, it was worth it. His eyes slid closed. His men poured in around them, and in the distance, sirens. And something else, the thing Ji-hwan had set in motion before he came. The truth, finally breaking, news vans and reporters, and a tip that was about to detonate a presidential campaign. The screen, as they say, goes black, and for a few terrible moments, the whole world, and Denali, believed that Seo Ji-hwan was dead. But before we find out, let me tell you what his last act accomplished, because Ji-hwan, even bleeding out, had won. The evidence he'd aimed at the media hit all at once, and it was undeniable. The buried trafficking records, the witnesses, Denali's mother's 20-year-old testimony. The proof of what had really happened the night that orphanage burned. It broke across the country like a tidal wave on every screen, impossible to bury, impossible to spin. Senator Arthur Kang, philanthropist, family man, presidential frontrunner, was exposed as a child trafficker and a murderer of children in the span of a single news cycle. His campaign didn't just end, it imploded. He was arrested in front of the same cameras that had been celebrating him a week earlier. His life's careful work collapsing into the small graves it had always been built on. And his son, Dr. Kang Min-jae, the safe man, the kind one, had to watch his father's monstrous truth come out on live television and learn, along with the rest of the world, what the man who raised him really was. He was innocent. He genuinely was, but some inheritances can't be refused, and Min-jae disappeared from public life to carry a name that now meant something unbearable. The kindest mercy the story gives him is this. He was never a villain. He was just another person the senator's evil reached out and ruined. He stepped aside from Denali's life with quiet grace, because what else could he do? The villain fell. The truth won. The children, 20 years gone, finally had someone say their names out loud. But Denali wasn't thinking about any of that. Denali was sitting in a hospital waiting room, exactly where she'd spent her whole career standing on the other side, waiting to find out if the man she'd loved for 20 years and only just gotten back was going to live. Months passed. I'll be honest with you about those months. They were hard and they were quiet, and the story doesn't pretend otherwise. Denali went back to her life. Her mother, unburdened at last of a 20-year secret, slowly got stronger. The bills stayed mysteriously paid, and Denali carried a grief she couldn't fully explain to anyone, because how do you explain mourning a man you'd known for 3 weeks and 20 years at the same time? She started going to the beach. It helped. The bigness of it, the way the ocean didn't care about anyone's troubles. She'd sit and watch the water and let herself remember the lonely boy in the redcoat winter and the dangerous man who'd thrown himself in front of a bullet and try to make her heart accept that they were the same person, and both of them were gone. And on a gray afternoon, with the wind off the water and her braids whipping around her face, she heard a voice behind her. A voice with a quiet, lightly accented warmth she would have known anywhere. You still owe me 20 years of friendship. Denali went absolutely still. Then she turned, and Seo Ji-hwan was standing there, alive, thinner, leaning slightly on a cane, a careful stillness in the way he held the side that had taken the bullet, but alive, and smiling. Not the dangerous smile, not the boss, just the boy from the yard, finally standing on a beach with the woman he'd searched the whole world for, with no violence in him at all. They told me you died, she whispered. I'm very hard to get rid of, he said. I had a lot of practice surviving things, and I had a reason to come back this time that I never had before. He took a step toward her. I spent 20 years looking for a little girl in a photograph. I'm done looking now. Can I stop? Denali crossed the distance between them and grabbed him, carefully, mindful of the wound, fiercely, the way a 7-year-old had once grabbed a lonely boy in a frozen yard. And neither of them said anything for a long time because some things don't need translating. They got married on a quiet day with no syndicate and no danger and no fear, just the two of them. Denali's recovered mother weeping in the front row and a handful of Ji-hwan's men standing in the back in their black suits, pretending the dust was getting in their eyes. On their wedding night, Denali traced the enormous tattoo across his back, her own 7-year-old face smiling, the thing that had kept a monster tethered to his own humanity for 20 years. You carried me on your back, she said softly. For 20 years. Ji-hwan turned and pulled her close, and the most feared man in Korea, who was in the end just the lonely boy who'd finally been found, shook his head. No, he said. I carried you on my back so I wouldn't forget your face. He pressed his hand over his own chest. But I carried you here the whole time. That's the part that never needed a tattoo. That's the part that was never going to fade. And Denali James, the little girl who'd once walked across a frozen yard to ask a lonely boy why he was sitting by himself, finally understood that the simplest, smallest kindness she'd ever done, a kindness she'd forgotten was even remarkable, had reached across 20 years and half the world and saved them both. She'd given a throwaway boy a photograph and a promise, and he'd turned it into a reason to survive everything and come back and find her. If that wrecked you even a little, if you felt that ending in your chest, do me a favor and tell me in the comments who walked over to the lonely kid in your life, or who did you walk over to? I read every single one. And tell me the moment that got you. The tattoo reveal in the very first scene, the photograph falling out of his jacket onto her hospital floor, when he found the matching half in her bedroom and finally understood, or I carried you here the whole time. Subscribe because more stories like this are coming, and ring the bell so YouTube can't bury them. He was a boy the world threw away. She was the only one who walked over. Never underestimate the smallest kindness. You never know which one is going to come back 20 years later and save a life. I'll see you in the next one.